Mark Jensen had lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Estates for nearly 7 years. A hard-working specialist for a healthcare software company, Mark valued his weekends as sacred recovery time from the high-pressure environment of his job. At 42, divorced with no children, he had carefully cultivated his modest ranch-style home into a personal retreat. The crown jewel of his property was the above-ground pool he had invested in 3 summers ago, a 15-foot circular setup that occupied the sunniest portion of his fenced backyard. Mark had researched pools for months before making his purchase, comparing brands, reading reviews, and calculating maintenance costs. He'd installed it himself with help from his brother over a long weekend, carefully leveling the ground and setting up the filtration system according to specifications. The pool had become his sanctuary during the scorching summer months in this part of the Midwest, where humidity often made the air feel like soup. After long work weeks, tearing at code and troubleshooting system crashes, Mark would float on his back in the cool water, watching clouds drift across the sky and feeling the workday tension melt away. His previous neighbors, an elderly couple named the Wilsons, had barely noticed the pool's existence. They'd wave when they saw Mark in his yard, but respected his privacy as he respected theirs. The neighborhood had an unspoken code of polite distance that suited Mark perfectly. Then last spring, after the Wilsons moved to Florida to be closer to their grandchildren, the Camerons arrived. A moving van appeared on a Saturday, and Mark, being neighborly despite his preference for solitude, had walked over to introduce himself. Tom Cameron seemed decent enough, a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company who immediately launched into a monologue about the housing market and their steal of the purchase price. But it was Patricia Cameron who immediately set off subtle warning bells in Mark's mind. "Call me Trish," she'd insisted with a wide smile that displayed professionally whitened teeth. She was impeccably dressed even on moving day, her highlighted blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that seemed too youthful for a woman Mark guessed to be in her late 30s. She had peppered him with questions about the neighborhood, who lived where, which families had children, who served on the HOA board. Mark had answered vaguely, increasingly eager to retreat back to his own space. The pool became a topic of conversation almost immediately after the Camerons settled in. Patricia, whom Mark would later mentally rename Karen after witnessing her behavior at the neighborhood's Memorial Day barbecue, where she complained about the substandard hot dogs being served, began to appear at her kitchen window whenever Mark was in his pool. She would wave enthusiastically, sometimes calling out questions about water chemistry or filter maintenance. "That's such a cute little pool," she commented one evening as Mark was skimming leaves from the surface. She leaned over the fence that separated their properties, a glass of white wine in her hand. "The boys are just dying for a pool. Tom keeps promising we'll get one installed, but you know how men are with their promises." She laughed as if sharing a secret joke. Mark answered her questions politely if briefly, explaining his maintenance routine and the basics of chlorine levels. He had no idea these seemingly innocent conversations were laying the groundwork for the conflict to come, a conflict that would eventually involve property damage, police reports, and court appearances. Had he known, he might have been less forthcoming, might have built a taller fence, might have nipped Patricia's sense of entitlement in the bud. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. As June's temperatures climbed into the high 80s, Mark began to notice the Cameron children, Ethan and Tyler, aged 8 and 10 respectively, appearing like clockwork whenever he used his pool. At first, it was just occasional glimpses of the tops of their heads bobbing above the fence line. Eventually, it grew bolder, dragging their plastic play structure close to the property line so they could stand on it and watch Mark swim. Their stares made him uncomfortable, but he tried to ignore them, understanding that children would naturally be curious about a neighbor's pool during a heat wave. The third weekend of June brought temperatures pushing into the 90s. Mark had just finished his Saturday morning lawn maintenance routine and was coiling up the garden hose when Patricia emerged from her back door, carrying a tray with what appeared to be lemonade and cookies. She was wearing white capri pants and a floral sleeveless blouse that seemed too formal for backyard chores. "Mark." Perfect timing, she called, her voice carrying across both yards with practiced projection. "I just made some fresh lemonade. Why don't you come over and take a break?" Trapped by politeness, Mark reluctantly crossed to the property line. Patricia handed him a glass decorated with lemons, condensation already forming on its surface. The lemonade was too sweet, with an artificial aftertaste that suggested powder mix rather than fresh squeezed. "You know, Mark," Patricia said, gesturing toward her sons who were conspicuously playing with water guns nearby, occasionally glancing in their direction. "The boys just love watching you enjoy your pool." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which remained calculating. "I was thinking, since you're just one person and that pool can fit several people, maybe the boys could come over sometimes. Just on weekdays when you're at work, so we wouldn't disturb you." Mark nearly choked on his lemonade. He set the glass down on the fence post. "I'm sorry, Patricia, but I can't have unsupervised children using my pool when I'm not home." It's a liability issue and my insurance wouldn't cover it. He wasn't actually certain about his insurance policy's specifics regarding guests, but it seemed like a reasonable objection. Patricia's smile tightened, creating little lines around her mouth that her foundation couldn't quite conceal. Oh, I wouldn't sue if anything happened. And I'd be with them, of course. She waved her hand dismissively. We're not the type to make legal trouble. We're churchgoers. She said this as if it were an irrefutable character reference. I'm still not comfortable with that arrangement, Mark replied firmly, choosing his words carefully. Swimming pools require constant supervision, and I wouldn't feel right having others use it when I'm not present. But, he added, seeing her expression hardening, they're welcome to come over sometime when I'm having a barbecue or something. Patricia nodded, but the warmth in her demeanor had noticeably cooled. Sure, we'll wait for an invitation then. She emphasized the last words slightly, making it clear she expected one soon. She collected Mark's barely touched lemonade and returned to her sons, speaking to them in a hushed voice that nonetheless carried phrases like not very neighborly and all by himself in that big pool. No invitation came the following weeks. Mark valued his privacy and rarely entertained. The few friends he had over were typically longtime buddies from college or work colleagues for the occasional poker night, not neighborhood families with young children. He noticed Patricia watching from her kitchen window whenever his rare guests arrived, her expression a mixture of curiosity and resentment. The expected invitation became an unspoken tension hovering between their properties, growing heavier with each weekend that passed. July arrived with a vengeance, bringing a heat wave that pushed temperatures into the high 90s for days on end. The local news warned of excessive heat advisories, and the neighborhood became unusually quiet as families retreated to air-conditioned interiors or fled to the community pool across town. Mark noticed a distinct shift in Patricia's behavior as the mercury rose. Her previously forced politeness evaporated like morning dew under the relentless sun. When they happened to be outside at the same time, she made pointed comments that were clearly meant for his ears. It's just sad how some people lack any sense of community spirit, she remarked loudly to her husband one evening as Mark was checking his pool's chlorine levels. In my parents' neighborhood, everyone shared what they had. Another time, as Mark returned from work, Patricia was watering her flower beds. The boys are just miserable in this heat, she called out to him. Some people have all the luxuries to themselves while others suffer. Seems rather selfish, doesn't it? Mark chose not to engage, limiting his responses to brief nods or pretending not to hear. This strategy failed to discourage Patricia. Twice that week, Mark found children's toys in his yard, a plastic action figure and a water gun that appeared to have been deliberately thrown over the fence. He tossed them back without comment. The situation reached a breaking point on the third Wednesday of July. Mark had been called into an emergency meeting that morning to address a critical system failure at work. The crisis had taken hours to resolve, and he texted his boss that he would work from home for the remainder of the day. Exhausted and looking forward to a quick cool-off in his pool before diving back into his laptop, Mark pulled into his driveway shortly after 2 p.m. He entered through his front door, set down his laptop bag, and was halfway through loosening his tie when he heard unfamiliar splashing sounds from his backyard. Frowning, he walked through his living room to the sliding glass door that led to his deck. The sight that greeted him left him momentarily speechless. Patricia, wearing a blue one-piece swimsuit, was lounging on one of Mark's pool floats, one he kept in a storage box on his deck. Tyler and Ethan were engaged in a spirited game of catch with a beach ball, their excited shouts filling the air. A small cooler that Mark didn't recognize sat open on his deck, along with a pile of brightly colored towels. For several seconds, Mark simply stared through the glass, trying to process the brazen invasion of his property. He took a deep breath, slid open the door, and stepped onto his deck. Patricia, he called out, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. What are you doing in my yard? Patricia hardly looked up, adjusting her sunglasses instead. Oh, Mark, you're home early. Her tone was casual, as if they had a standing arrangement. The boys were just dying in this heat. I remembered where you keep the spare key, so we let ourselves in. Hope you don't mind. We'll be done in an hour or so. Mark gripped the deck railing, his knuckles whitening. I never told you about a spare key. How did you get into my yard? Don't be so dramatic, Patricia said with a dismissive wave. Your gate was unlocked. This was a lie. Mark always locked his gate, a habit from years of urban living before moving to the suburbs. You need to leave. Now. Mark's voice was controlled but firm. Patricia's face hardened, the pleasant mask slipping. Don't be ridiculous. The boys are already wet. Let them finish swimming. It's not like you were using it. She emphasized the last part as if his absence somehow justified her trespassing. August in Oakwood Estates brought a subtle shift in the neighborhood's rhythm. Families trickled back from vacations, school supply lists appeared on refrigerators, and the community's collective attention began turning toward the approaching fall. For Mark, the month brought no relief from the tension with the Camerons. His newly installed security camera had already proven its worth. 3 times in the week following the trespassing incident, the system had alerted him to motion near his fence line. The footage showed Ethan and Tyler peering over or attempting to climb the fence before Patricia's voice would call them back. Each incident left Mark with a churning sensation in his stomach, a mixture of anger and apprehension about what might come next. The neighborhoods had chosen sides without Mark actively seeking allies. Barbara Thompson, whose property backed up to Mark's on the opposite side from the Camerons, stopped him one morning as he retrieved his newspaper. "I saw what happened with Patricia and her boys," she said in a low voice, glancing toward the Cameron house. "You're not the first, you know. The Mitchells 2 streets over had similar problems when they got a new trampoline last year. Patricia just doesn't understand boundaries." Other neighbors were less supportive. Mark received cool nods rather than friendly waves from several families with children, suggesting Patricia had been sharing her version of events throughout the neighborhood. The monthly HOA newsletter included a passive-aggressive article about fostering community spirit through sharing amenities, which Mark strongly suspected had been influenced by Patricia, who had recently joined the association's social committee. Direct encounters with the Camerons had become excruciating exercises in restrained hostility. Patricia would pointedly turn away when they crossed paths, sometimes shepherding her children to the other side of the street as if Mark were somehow dangerous. Tom Cameron, who had previously been cordial, if not particularly friendly, now gave Mark cold stares when their paths crossed at the neighborhood mailboxes. "You know, a pool isn't worth all this trouble," Tom muttered one afternoon, just loud enough for Mark to hear. The implication was clear. The conflict was Mark's fault for not accommodating their demands. The tension escalated when Mark found an anonymous complaint filed with the HOA about the eyesore of equipment visible in his yard, clearly referring to his pool pump and filter system, which were neatly maintained and partially screened by decorative shrubs. The complaint also mentioned excessive noise pollution from recreational activities, though Mark rarely had guests and was careful about noise levels. The HOA president, a reasonable man named Richard, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, called Mark about the complaint. "Between you and me," Richard said after explaining the situation, "this isn't the first complaint we've received from that quarter. I'm not taking any action. Your setup is well within guidelines. Just wanted to give you a heads up." By the 3rd week of August, Mark found himself using his pool less and less despite the continuing warm weather. The joy of his backyard oasis had been poisoned. Each time he considered taking a refreshing dip, he found himself scanning the fence line, checking his security app, and tensing at unexpected sounds. What had once been a source of relaxation had become a source of stress. Labor Day weekend arrived, traditionally the last hurrah of swimming season. Mark usually left his pool up until mid-September, taking advantage of the occasional warm days before fall fully set in. But as he sipped his morning coffee on Saturday, watching clouds drift across the late summer sky, he made his decision. "Enough," he said aloud to his empty kitchen. "It's not worth it." That morning, Mark began the process of draining the pool for the season. He pulled the drain plug and attached a long hose to direct the water toward the street drain. As he worked, he noticed Patricia watching from an upstairs window of her house, her silhouette clearly visible through the curtains. The awareness of being observed only strengthened his resolve. By afternoon, the pool was empty. Mark began disassembling the metal frame, methodically removing the supports and carefully folding the liner to prevent damage. The components were arranged neatly on his lawn, the liner drying on his deck, the frame pieces stacked by size, the filtration system partially disassembled for cleaning and storage. Despite the unpleasant circumstances prompting his decision, there was something satisfying about the orderly process, about reclaiming control over his property and his peace of mind. Sunday morning dawned clear and mild, the kind of perfect late summer day that typically lifted Mark's spirits. He had slept better than he had in weeks, relieved by his decision to dismantle the pool and eliminate the source of neighborhood tension. Wrapped in a worn but comfortable robe, a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in hand, he settled into his favorite armchair near the front window to flip through the Sunday paper and enjoy the quiet. The pounding on his front door just after 8:30 a.m. was so sudden and violent that Mark nearly spilled coffee across the sports section. The aggressive hammering continued, echoing through his living room. Mark set down his mug and paper, tightening the belt of his robe as he crossed to the door. Through the peephole, he could see Patricia standing on his porch. Even a distorted fisheye view couldn't disguise her agitation. Her face was flushed, her posture rigid with anger. Briefly, Mark considered ignoring her, but the pounding resumed, more insistent this time. With a deep sigh, he unlocked and opened the door, keeping his expression neutral. "What have you done with your pool?" Patricia demanded without greeting or preamble. She wore white tennis shorts and a pink polo shirt, as if dressed for a country club brunch rather than a neighborhood confrontation. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her complexion had reddened in blotchy patches, a physical manifestation of her anger. Mark blinked, genuinely confused by both her presence and her question. "I took it down for the season." "Why?" "You took it down because you're a spiteful, selfish man," Patricia spat, jabbing an accusing finger toward his chest without quite touching him. Her voice carried across the quiet Sunday morning neighborhood. Mark noticed the Johnsons across the street pausing their newspaper retrieval to watch the drama unfold. "You knew the boys were looking forward to using it next weekend. I already told them they could." Mark's momentary confusion hardened into anger, his jaw tightening. "I never agreed to that. Not once. It's my pool, Patricia. I decide when to take it down." "You're doing this to punish us," she shouted, her voice climbing an octave. A small vein pulsed visibly at her temple. "After all the neighborly things I've done for you." "What neighborly things?" Mark countered, his voice low but intense. He was conscious of the public nature of this confrontation, of curtains twitching in nearby houses. "You trespassed in my yard and used my pool without permission. You filed a bogus complaint with the HOA. You've been talking about me to other neighbors. Is that your definition of neighborly?" He gripped the edge of the door. "Now please leave." Patricia's face contorted with an emotion that went beyond simple anger. There was entitlement there and disbelief as she wasn't getting her way. "You don't understand? I promised the boys. We've invited friends over for a pool party next Saturday, Tyler's birthday party. 8 children are expecting to swim." This revelation stunned Mark into momentary silence. She had not only promised her own children access to his pool, but had invited guests, all without a word to him. Taking his silence as an opening, Patricia continued, her tone shifting to something resembling negotiation. "Just put it back up for one more weekend. We'll supply all the snacks and supervision. You won't have to do anything." Mark shook his head slowly, incredulous at her audacity. "That's not happening, Patricia. You can't invite people to use someone else's property without permission. That's not how the world works." Patricia's attempt at reason evaporated. Her voice rose to a shriek that echoed down the quiet street. "You'll put that pool back up by next weekend, or there will be consequences. You're ruining Tyler's birthday. Do you want to explain to an 8-year-old why his party is canceled?" "Your poor planning is not my emergency," Mark replied evenly, though his heart raced with the confrontation. "I suggest you look into the community pool or reschedule your party." Patricia's eyes narrowed to slits. This isn't over. The quiet menace in her voice was somehow more disturbing than her previous shouting. Before Mark could respond, she stormed off his porch, her sandals slapping against the concrete. He closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as his pulse gradually slowed. The encounter had left him shaken, not by fear, but by the sheer irrationality of her demands and the implicit threat in her parting words. For good measure, he checked that his security camera was still functioning properly, making sure it had clear views of both his front porch and his backyard. Something in Patricia's tone suggested this conflict was far from over.